What if the strangest discoveries of modern physics had a spiritual twin, not to prove anything about science, but to help our hearts see something we already live? If two particles can be mysteriously linked across space, what if your heart and someone else's are already entangled by the hand of God, bound, responsive, and moved together? I say this only as a metaphor, not as a scientific claim. The language of quantum entanglement will serve here as an image to help us feel how the unseen ties between people can be real, immediate, and powerful when the spirit moves. In the little village of St. Augustine, where lanterns shivered against the evening mist and the bell of the old chapel still marked morning and night, Mary kept a small, steady light on her kitchen table. It was a candle with a dented glass cup, the wax pooled like a small pond around a single wick. She would sit by that light after the chores were done, hands folded in solitude, praying until the sound of her breath matched the soft click of shutters closing. To the casual passerby, she was a church leader, a mother with a kind face and a reputation for hosting hymn practices that lingered long into the night. To those who knew her up close, she was a woman with a particular ache, her son James. James had been bright and blunt and quick to laugh as a boy. Those who remembered him from church potlucks could still hear his voice, thick with mischief. But under the laughter something had taken root. A habit, a hiding, a slow slide into days measured by the next moment he could numb the pain. Addiction, the neighbors would say in low tones, a family wound, the kind that brings quiet shame and hard laughter. Mary's nights were now split between prayer and the attempts to pull James back into daily life. She had tried counsel, quiet corrections, and the small ritual of leaving soup on the step that sat untouched until the soup had cooled to sorrow. There was a split in the congregation as well. Some believed fervently that God would move, that prayer could be the first step in a new birth. Others watched from the edges, the skeptical ones whose trust had been worn thin by disappointment. Thomas, an elder with a well-rolled brow and hands made steady by years of carpentry, would say softly that compassion must meet action. Faith without a plan risked naivete. Miriam, who kept the community garden and always smelled faintly of basil, would tilt her head and plant a seed anyway. Clara, a woman with an open laugh who had once been labeled by illness and dismissed by doctors, stood as a quiet contradiction, a living testimony, not flaunted, but known. She had come back to life in ways that carried more mystery than explanation. On a damp evening in late autumn, when fog seemed to gather like a listening thing around the chapel yard, Mary had a dream. In it she stood under a tree that was simultaneously young and ancient, a tree whose limbs were threaded with light like veins. The tree shimmered not with leaves but with the faces of the people she loved. She reached for one, a small trembling hand, and felt the warmth of it match her own heartbeat, as if two separate pulses had been beaten on the same drum. The dream left her with a sense of being held in a wider net than her own worry. She woke before dawn, the candle guttering with a sudden draught, and the image of hands linked under a luminous tree stayed. The dream became the spark. Mary, in the weeks that followed, could not keep her prayer private. She began tentatively to call neighbors and say, "Would you come and pray for James tonight?" Some evenings a few arrived, then more. They would sit in the hush of the chapel with a single candle at the center and let scripture, soft music, and the sharing of burdens create a pattern of listening. People began to report small things, a dream slipping into waking life, a sudden clarity about a choice, an inexplicable cheerfulness after an hour of prayer. None of these were proofs offered like evidence. They were experiences narrated in the quiet, offered as testimonies that moved others to listen. This was Revelation 1, Interconnectedness. The village discovered that what touched one touched many. Mary's longing did not remain her private ache. Her voice pulled on threads in other hearts. The candlelight, the shared songs, the folded hands, these ordinary things became the language by which a community practiced being linked. In this discovery there was no magic formula, only a recurring pattern. Someone named a need, Someone else showed up. Their presence altered the texture of the need. A prayer lifted, and responses followed. Calls made to find a bed in a treatment home. Neighbors passing on extra work to free up a morning. An old friend sending a short mercy note. It's easy to misread these moments as causal in the way a scientist might demand. They are not that. They are not experiments. They are encounters. Still, there is a pattern, a metaphorical entanglement, where connection creates correlation. Mary's small petition created ripples, and the ripples reached farther than she could see. This is what the village learned in that first season, that to pray together is to weave a net that catches more than one soul's fall. One night, after a circle of prayer, Mary offered a brief, simple invocation out loud, and the room bowed. Lord, bind us to one another that what we bear might be borne together. Make our hands a place of safety for those who stagger. Her voice held both the tremor of a mother and the firmness of a leader. That line, what we bear might be borne together, became a phrase repeated in kitchens and on back porches. It sounded like justice for the weary. If this message is touching something in you, a place you want lifted, a knot you want loosened, stay with this story. Join the circle that learns by doing. Subscribe and come back for more reflections on how these truths unfolded in St. Augustine. Revelation 2. Non-local compassion. James's experience would be central to this. He never spoke much about the nights he woke with the taste of smoke in his mouth or the ache like a fist behind his ribs. But in the hush of the chapel, as neighbors spoke of small mercies, someone mentioned a dream similar to Mary's, a child running through fog carrying a light. And James, unexpectedly, raised his hand. He described a dream he had had weeks before, long before anyone else had described a tree. He had been walking down a corridor of doors, each door marked with a name, and behind one was Mary, kneeling with a candle. He could not say why he imagined her there. In the waking world, they had not spoken in 3 days. He woke with a sudden, ridiculous conviction to call his mother. He did. And though they argued and cried, the phone call broke a small dam. The next day, he showed up at a meeting of the circle, shaking, apologetic, and holding a thermally wrapped cup of coffee as if it were an offering. Here, the village saw again how compassion moves beyond visible boundaries. The image they used, non-locality, borrowed from the language of physics to give a name to a spiritual reality they were now walking in. Sometimes our love reaches across distances that seem real and immovable. A prayer said in a chapel, a candle lit in a kitchen, a letter dropped in a mailbox. These acts traveled beyond lines on a map. They arrived in ways that the people could not chart but could attest to. The elders, who preferred to measure with charts and lists, found themselves learning to measure differently, by presence, by small changes in behavior, by the return of a laugh. Between these ripples came moments of both grace and mess. Thomas, the carpenter, watched James with suspicion at first. He had seen those he loved fall, and then fall again. His watchfulness was a form of love, too. He worried that hope left untempered by structure could become fantasy. And yet even Thomas, who kept a list of appointments tacked by his door, and a ledger of practicalities, found himself showing up at the second meeting because Mary had asked him to bring extra chairs. He told himself he would be the practical presence in a room of dreamers. But after the prayer circle, he confessed to a sleepless night he had not expected. The net was catching him as well. Revelation 3. Synchrony and timing. Clara's testimony found its place here. For years, Clara's body had been a slow battlefield. Doctors had shaken their heads. Friends had muttered helpless prayers, and the community had offered rides and casseroles until their arms ached. Then, on a morning when frogs called from the creek and the first frost had left the grass rimed like sugar, Clara walked into the chapel and sat down without the limp she had carried so long. She later described the moment as a falling into proper timing, like catching a rhythm she had been offbeat from for years. Neighbors who had prayed said it was not a sudden show of magic, so much as a change so obvious it became contagious. Clara's return to the ordinary, the ability to stand at the stove and chop vegetables without dizzying fog, drew others into a steadier hope. There were many narratives that could have explained Clara's change: a new medicine, an unaccounted for rest, the sheer momentum of community attention. The village chose to see it as another form of synchrony, events arriving not by chance but by a providential cadence that sometimes aligns when hearts gather. There is an old biblical rhythm to these moments: call and respond, seed and harvest, morning and evening sacrifice, and in Saint Augustine the people felt themselves pulled into that ancient music. The child who had appeared in various dreams, a small messenger who always seemed to carry a lantern, showed up at Clara's bedside on the day she first regained steady steps. The child's presence was not an explanation, but a sign, a thin beacon in the narrative that said, "Pay attention." Providence, the village learned, often disguises itself in the garments of timing. They began to mark time differently. Instead of saying, "We have tried and failed," they began to say, "We are waiting to see what God will do next." That subtle shift, from the flat despair of "we tried" to the expectant posture of "we are waiting," changed how they planned. They scheduled visits and follow-ups with a new gentleness. When an opportunity to start a community garden came, the group rolled up sleeves rather than simply shaking heads. Miriam took the lead on the garden because she had always led quietly. She drew lines in the soil and named the plots after those who usually had no space to grow. There was pushback. Skepticism kept its seat at the table as a necessary critic. Doubt prevented foolish leaps. Thomas reminded the group that compassion required resources and caution, and he was not wrong. But the measure that began to matter most to the people of St. Augustine was not only whether a plan would succeed in the ledger of outcomes. It was whether the plan enabled neighbors to stand with one another long enough for the small miracles of daily kindness to accrue into something visible. In those days, the chapel's little kitchen became a hub of movement. Lists pinned to the wall, a spread of leftover pies, a hand-painted sign that read, simply, "Gathering of Hope." The name came naturally because hope seemed to arrive when the circle came together. Plans were practical: a weekly meal, a job board, rides to the clinic. And they were spiritual: an invitation to tell stories of grace, a place where someone could put down their burden and feel seen. Mary, with the Tree of Light image still vivid in her mind, suggested that they give a visible sign to their gatherings, a sapling set at the chapel's edge, wrapped in little strips of cloth where people could tie prayers and names. They planted the tree on a Sunday when the sun burned through the morning fog like a promise. The sapling was thin, its trunk no thicker than a walking stick, but it seemed to drink the conversation around it. People tied cloths and whispered names into the fibers. A child, the same messenger who had appeared in dreams, or who had become the image of their hopes, took a ribbon and braided it into the sapling's slender branches. Children laughed, and adults wept quietly. Thomas stood with his hands deep in his coat pockets, trying to look outwardly composed. He later confessed he had knelt beneath the sapling because something in him had found a place to rest. These early gatherings were not triumphal. They were small and often messy. Men forgot to bring tools, casseroles burned, a sermon note was misread, and the community ended up singing an old hymn instead of hearing a planned exhortation. Yet in the mess, a coherence began to form. People who had been islands found bridges. The metaphor of entanglement settled deeper. When the community aligned, not perfectly but intentionally, the effects were amplified. A phone call made by one neighbor to a social worker turned into a job interview for another. A song sung around a small fire gave someone the courage to enter a clinic. Amplification by coherence is not a law of words. It is an observed pattern of lived faith. When a group's prayers and practical actions gather in the same direction, their impact often exceeds the sum of single efforts. Mary kept careful notes, not of miracles she could claim, but of small convergences. Who showed up, where resources pooled, when a stubborn hope finally bent toward possibility. Clara began to lead a bedtime storytelling hour for the children, and James started to attend a workshop about work skills put together by Thomas. An arrangement Thomas had agreed to, wryly, after letting himself be moved into action by Mary's steady insistence. These were small stitches in a larger fabric. There is a risk in language like this. It can sound as if faith were simply a powerful technique to get certain results. It is not. Faith in St. Augustine meant an orientation toward God that risked vulnerability, compassion that cost something, obedience that might look foolish on a ledger. When Mary and the others used the image of entanglement, they were careful to say it was only a metaphor for how God knits people together. They did not claim that prayer manipulates matter like a laboratory process. Rather, they were pointing to a spiritual reality they believed in, that when love and prayer gather, God often meets them in ways that rearrange lives. As the gatherings continued, signs kept appearing in the ordinary textures of life. The fog that often sat over the valley would sometimes lift right after the circle had prayed, leaving the world sharp and clear with dew. A neighbor would awaken from a dream and, as if remembering a map, call an estranged brother. A child would bring a bouquet of roadside wildflowers to the chapel and lay them by the candle. These were not incontrovertible proofs. They were narratives that stitched the village together. They were meaning-making in a community that had decided to look for God's seam. Not all were convinced. A few thought these patterns were coincidence, a human tendency to see order where randomness reigned. The village itself became a space for honest disagreement. Thomas continued to press for plans and evaluations. Miriam insisted on tending the soil and the souls. Clara insisted on laughing in the face of fear, because laughter was a kind of prayer. James oscillated between days of thin hope and days when the old patterns called him back. Yet each swing of his heart was slower now. Each day his return seemed more likely. On a wet evening when the chapel glowed amber and the new saplings swayed in a cautious breeze, a child, the young messenger whose name never settled in the records because every witness remembered her differently, arrived with a folded scrap of paper. She handed it to Mary and said nothing more than, "For the next gathering." Inside was a list. Who could bring which dish? Who could offer rides? Which neighborhood could use an extra coat? The list was modest, and yet it was a map toward action. It spoke of humility and practical charity. At the next planning meeting, when the room circled its shoulders against the cold and spread maps on the table, Mary listened as voices made plans for outreach. The gathering of hope would not remain a closed circle. They would go outward, a home visitation, a garden turned open to neighbors in need, a night when the chapel would hold a table and warm hands and a place to stay. But the turning outward raised questions. How would they move beyond the prayer circle without losing what had glowed inside? Could their coherence carry into the wider community? Would James be able to stand and speak to a group that might look at him and see only what he had been? Would Thomas allow himself to be vulnerable in front of the people he had always thought of as projects rather than neighbors? And what of Clara? Would her steady regain be mistaken for miraculous resolution when it was fragile and ongoing? The people of St. Augustine felt both the thrill of momentum and the weight of responsibility. They had tasted a new way of being connected. They had found that when prayers were lifted together, responses sometimes came in untraceable patterns. They had seen that a dream could become a call to action, and that timing could carry providence. They had planted a sapling as a symbol, but symbols must be tended, or they become mere ornaments. On a night when the wind flattened the candle flame to a trembling filament, Mary wrote a short note and left it under the candle glass. It read, "Lord, teach us to be faithful in small things. Keep our hearts tethered to the work and to one another." She folded her hands and prayed aloud for a moment, her voice low and intimate. "Father, give James courage. Give us all the wisdom to act with love. Make this little circle a place where your mercy is practiced and not only talked about." When the meeting concluded, people left with scarves wrapped tighter and lists in their pockets. The sapling at the chapel's edge had more ribbons. James walked farther than he had in weeks. For the first time in a long while, Mary allowed herself a small, guarded breath of relief. And yet there remained a tension like a chord unresolved. The village had begun to operate in a new frequency, one that promised amplification when coherence held. But coherence required more than intention. It required continued sacrifice, disciplined tenderness, and the willingness to be observed in the places most tender. Would the community sustain it? Would the next few weeks prove the pattern or unravel it? As the Gathering of Hope's first public outreach approached, plans solidified and questions multiplied. Thomas arranged tools and volunteers for home repairs. Miriam drew diagrams for the garden beds that would teach neighbors to grow their own food. Clara prepared to tell her story, not as a polished testimony, but as truth. Messy, ongoing, real. Mary felt the weight and warmth of leadership in equal measure. James, uncertain but present, agreed to stand with the team at the outreach table. He could not yet promise steadiness, but he promised presence. The village of St. Augustine had entered into a season where ordinary acts carried extraordinary tension. The metaphor of entanglement, two hearts linked, two pulses beating in sympathy, had helped them name a thing they had been living. They were learning that revelations come in sequences. A dream begins a stir. Prayer calls forth neighbors. Timing appears as providence. Coherence amplifies action. There were more revelations to come, each one deepening their understanding of what it meant to be intertwined in God's work. As the night of the outreach drew near, Mary stood by her window and watched the tree of light sapling silhouette against the moon. She felt the village's hopes like a soft pressure against her ribs. She breathed a short prayer, simple and direct. Jesus, keep our hands gentle and our wills surrendered. Let us be instruments of your mercy. Then she drew the curtain and stepped into the cold to meet her neighbors, to help pin coats on hangers, to fold chairs and light one brave candle for a room that hoped to become a home for more than just themselves. Mary moved through the cold like someone carrying a small, holy duty. The chapel door closed behind her with a soft thud. The room within smelled of coffee and wool and the faint iron of old hymn books. Outside, the sapling bowed its new leaves to the night as if conceding the season's chill. Inside, the first coats were already hung, the folding chairs set in rows like a waiting congregation. Candles burned in jars, humble sentinels against the dark. People arrived in drips and waves, some with hands full of casseroles, others with boxes of blankets. A few faces were places Mary had not expected to see. Neighbors who usually kept their curtains drawn. A man from the next parish who had once been indifferent to the chapel's work. With them came the stirred curiosity a village carries when something new begins to breathe. There was nervous laughter, awkward halting conversation, and the sound of children's feet, not yet schooled in silence. James stood behind a folding table near the door, sleeves rolled up, offering coffee in paper cups. He wasn't steady on his feet. There were moments when his hands shook, but he met each person's eye as they approached and said a simple, clear thing. Welcome. Sit where you like. The sentence was small but true, and it was the kind of thing that, when spoken often enough, becomes a scaffold for a life. Clara had taken the corner near the hymnals, where the light was warmest. She had dressed in a sober dress with a knitted shawl, and her laugh came easily when someone told a clumsy, badly timed joke. Later, when the noise had softened and folding chairs creaked like old timber, she would stand and tell a story about a time she thought she would not live to see another spring. She did not paint herself as a miracle. She told of long exhaustion, the inscrutable mercy of small kindnesses, the one day when she woke and could stand without dizziness. People listened because the truth she told felt like something they could carry, weakness acknowledged, hope not exaggerated. Thomas had a clipboard. He had organized volunteers to repair a leaky roof at Mrs. Donovan's and had a list of tools ready. He moved through the room with the practical grace of someone used to making things hold together. There were moments when his jaw tightened. Old habits of measurement and caution surfaced in his words, yet his hands, a carpenter's hands, trembled when he reached to pull a blanket over a sleeping child. The place he had kept for skepticism began to look more like the place he kept for careful love. Miriam presided over a small table of seedlings, naming the herbs she hoped to see in the community garden. People tied slips of paper with names to one side of the sapling by the chapel as an offering, petitions, hopes, small confessions. The child, the one that everyone remembered differently, the young messenger, moved through the crowd with a tray of simple bread and honey, handing it out with a solemnity that made adults look as if they had been reminded of something important. They opened the doors at 7. The room filled quickly, heads bowed in pews, hands warming around cups, the sound of breathing like a low wind. The gathering of hope began in the usual way in St. Augustine. No fanfare, just a song hummed in the round, and a gentle invitation for anyone who wished to speak. The team had prepared a small table of information about local resources, job postings, a list of clinics, names of counselors, each sheet folded and ready to be taken. The first outreach moment felt like a pebble cast into a still pond. A woman named Hannah approached after the service. She had been living in a car for several months, keeping warm on nights with thick blankets and a cheap heater that made a frighteningly loud click. She took the paper with a job listing in her hands and cried, once, without shame. James reached for his coat without asking and offered a ride to the shelter where they could help her access support. For James, that ride was both an act and a reckoning, proximity to the mess he had once been inside, and a test of the steadiness he was trying to form. He drove, his knuckles white on the wheel, and he returned with a quiet that felt like the afterbreath of a labor. There were other scenes that night small enough to be missed by anyone not paying attention. A boy came with a scraped knee and found, not a flippant bandage, but a woman at the table who knew how to stitch a child's tear gently with both cloth and story. A man who had not seen his sister in 7 years was led, by a neighbor who had once been an enemy in the supermarket, to a phone where a number dialed produced trembling reconciliations. Thomas led a small crew to deliver tools to a man with a sagging porch. The man hugged Thomas's neck as if the wooden planks would become some kind of promised land. During the night, when the crowd thinned and the conversations grew intimate, Clara stood and spoke in a way that made even the hardest eyes soften. She did not claim a tidy miracle. She said, "There is no single moment that saved me. There were many small acts, rides, casseroles, someone who sat with me in a chair and did not try to fix my fear. There was a time I heard a child laugh and thought, maybe the world was not finished with me." Her voice was like a hand laid upon a wound, gentle and direct. She spoke of a day when, waking, she looked at a tree and felt in her chest a steadying beat. She called that day a gift. She urged those who were listening to let themselves be held by these small threads. Here the village felt the principle that would come to be called Revelation 4, amplification by coherence. That night provided 100 small instances, drives, warm meals, hands that smoothed blankets, each small on its own. Together they altered the shape of things. People who had previously offered a lone hand now found that their hands were part of a larger armature. When prayers and practical plans leaned in the same direction, the work of love did not just add, it multiplied. The checklist of services grew into a web of support. An invitation to a job fair turned into rides offered and interview coaching. A single phone call put a name on a waiting list for training, and from that name eventually came sustained employment. Between the service and the last hitching of coats, Mary had a moment by the sapling. She touched one of the little ribbons, feeling the dry weave under her thumb, and whispered a sentence like a blessing. "Let this tree remind us not to hoard what we have received." Her voice gathered itself slowly into a short petition. "Father, give us patience to repeat kindness enough times for it to hold." The prayer was quiet, inclusive. Give us. The communal plea of a woman who knew that her loneliness had been lifted by neighbors who refused to leave the net unattended. Not everyone left with their burdens tied neat and small. The next morning, the ledger of Mary's mind held both gratitude and worry. James had a good day, and then a night of temptation. Clara's steps remained steady most days and faltered at times. Thomas still asked for plans and guarantees. Miriam's seedlings were eaten by an early, cold snap. The work had momentum, but momentum did not erase the need for perseverance.
That was part of the pattern. The village learned that entanglement was not a method that guaranteed smoothness. It was an exposure that required faithfulness over time.
Weeks turned into a season of small, disciplined practices. The gathering of hope expanded its offerings. A weekly meal became a skill workshop, which became a rotating mentorship program. Thomas started a basic carpentry class on Saturday mornings for young men and women in town, teaching skills and offering the dignity of created work. Miriam organized the garden into a seed bank, and Clara began a circle for neighbors to share illness stories and not be ashamed anymore. James attended the work skills class and began an apprenticeship with a man who owned the bakery down the lane. He was not cured in a single scene. Some days relapse returned like an unwelcome tide. Yet each time he stumbled and returned, Mary and the circle gathered him with a careful, practiced steadiness. That steadiness, this repeated relational practice, was an essential feature of Revelation 5. Creation as witness. Creation. As witness began with small things the villagers noticed. Leaves soaking up light after they had prayed for morning clarity. A fog that dissolved in a way that felt like an answer to an earlier petition. A tree that seemed to bear more berries along the path where they had sown cloths and names. They began to read the world as a text that bore witness to God's movement. This was not a claim of mystical literalism. Trees do not write letters to human hearts in ink, but a posture of attentiveness. To see creation as witness meant to look for signs of God's compassion in the rhythms God already ordained. Seasons turning, seeds sprouting, rivers finding their level. It meant listening for God in the ordinary and rehearsing gratitude for small mercies. Mary's little notebook filled with these notations, an extra wildflower by the gate, a child bringing a bouquet of road-cut daisies after someone had casually prayed for a lonely neighbor. The people began to treat these moments as reminders, not proof. They stitched them into the fabric of their conversations. Do you remember when the fog lifted? And these stories became the village's liturgy. In those stories, they practiced seeing God at work in the created order without claiming the right to explain how. Short prayer between blocks. Lord, open our eyes to see the marks of your presence in the world around us. Help us read creation with humility and gratitude. Revelation 6, the observer effect of faith. The term borrowed again from physics, carefully as a metaphor, pointed to a spiritual truth the village began to inhabit, that faith changes the way people respond to what happens. The chapel gathered examples. When a mother came believing there would be help, she noticed options she had previously overlooked. When a man expected judgment, he failed to see the hands reaching toward him with bread. Faith was not a magic wand that rearranged atoms, but it was a lens that allowed people to perceive possibilities and then to act upon them. James's story illustrated this most painfully and beautifully. There were days when his assumption that he was unworthy led him to hide and use rather than to ask. On other days, when he believed he might be welcome, he accepted offers and arrived at appointments. The same event, a job interview, a chance to volunteer, was encountered differently depending on his inner posture. He would later tell Mary, in a voice thick with the memory of fear, that the hardest thing was learning to expect mercy. I kept looking for the trap, he said once. I forgot to look for the hand. That sentence became a communal confession among many in St. Augustine. We had been trained to look for scarcity, not for grace. The observer effect had a communal aspect too. When the group expected kindness to bear fruit, they worked with a steadier hope. When they assumed that efforts would fail, plans dissolved more quickly under the weight of discouragement. Small rituals helped, notes of encouragement tucked into coat pockets, neighbors affirming each other's presence, the simple discipline of reporting back to the circle what had happened during the week. These practices fostered a kind of expectancy that shaped outcomes without guaranteeing them. Interwoven with these spiritual principles were real tests. One winter evening, a man named Caleb, a newcomer who had once been violent, slid into the back of the chapel. He had been turned away by other places because of past mistakes. The room held its breath. Mary signaled to a woman to bring a blanket. Thomas hesitated, as did others. But the group's expectation that even a man like Caleb might be met shifted the choices people made. Instead of barring the door, they offered a seat. Part of the wonder was practical. Caleb found an employment lead through Thomas's carpentry list. Part of it was spiritual. Being received made him, for the first time in years, willing to consider receiving help. The observer effect in this case opened a way for this man to move. As the seasons turned, more neighbors told stories of small shifts. A single young woman, convinced she couldn't change her trajectory, accepted an invitation to a workshop and later found herself applying for a scholarship. A retired teacher began tutoring children who had been failing at school. The expectation of mercy made options visible, and options made new lives possible. There were also sober moments of reflection. The villagers recognized that observing with faith did not exempt them from hard responsibility. It did not allow them to act imprudently. Thomas was right to remind them that plans needed resources and follow-through. Expectancy without work was empty, yet work without expectancy could grow brittle. The balancing act became part of the village's apprenticeship. Between these scenes of growth, Mary would gather the leaders for a quick, low-key debrief. They would speak frankly of relapses and frustrations. They would map where resources were thin. Then they would pray a short, collective sentence. Lord, give us courage to keep showing up, and wisdom to steward what you provide. These small prayers stitched together practice and dependence. Revelation 7. Action follows. Revelation. The last truth unfolded in public ways. The gathering of hope moved from being a circle that held grief and hope into a movement that carried those things outward. Outreach became disciplined. Teams coordinated visits to houses. Menus were planned for community dinners. The sapling by the chapel became a meeting point for the garden's plans. The village learned that revelation, an insight or a vision, was not meant to be admired. It was meant to be obeyed. The night they launched the garden for neighbors, the village did something unexpected. They opened a central plot and dedicated it as a communal food source. The first harvest was small and lopsided, a crooked beet, a handful of herbs, a few tomatoes. They did not stage the harvest as a triumphant harvest festival. Instead, they sat down and ate together, thankful for the small yield and mindful of the work ahead. That meal, simple, slightly awkward, full of the honest chatter of people, felt like a sacrament. It was the kind of action that carried forward revelation without needing an extraordinary sign. James helped erect a small greenhouse frame. His hands grew surer by practice. He repaired the latch on the chapel door, a task so banal it could be missed, and the latch held through the winter. These were acts without headline-grabbing drama, but they were the daily obedience that kept the movement alive. James's presence at these ordinary tasks was, in effect, proof of a new orientation, action that flowed out of revelation and humility. The gathering of hope also tentatively extended help beyond the chapel's walls. They organized a neighborhood cleanup, painted a mural for the school, and coordinated with a distant shelter to take in one family in crisis. Each outward step revealed both their limits and their resources. They learned to collaborate with other churches and local agencies, not to claim credit, but to multiply hands in places where a single church could not manage alone. There were setbacks. Funding ran low at times, volunteer fatigue set in, and old resentments flared on occasion. James had a night when the old habits gnawed at him, and he slipped back into a solitude that tempted him toward old comforts. The village's response was not triumphant rhetoric, but practical tenderness. A neighbor stayed overnight, others brought food, Mary took a turn at the phone, and Thomas sat with him in the quiet. The relapse did not erase the months of small gains. It reminded the group how fragile progress can be, and how necessary long-term, patient presence is. In those hard nights, the metaphor of entanglement, ever carefully framed, kept its place as an image rather than an equation. The villagers said it aloud now and then. "We are entangled." By that they meant that their lives had become knotted together in ways that made distance meaningless for certain pains and certain joys. They reminded themselves often, this phrase is a metaphor, not a scientific claim. It was a tool they used to help love look more like what they believed God intended. A public moment crystallized their progress in a way that felt fitting. After months of steady work, the Gathering of Hope hosted an evening of testimony and prayer in the chapel, inviting the entire town. Word had spread beyond the village, and for once the chapel was crowded with strangers and neighbors alike. The sapling stood wrapped in new cloths. The child messenger walked the aisles, offering a small lantern to each family to light at home. Clara stood to speak, then James, then Thomas. Each testimony was simple. James's was not a dramatic conversion story. It was an honest recounting of small steps. He said, "I still have days I do wrong. I still fail sometimes. But I am learning to come back. I am learning to let people help me. That is a miracle to me." The room did not erupt in coarse celebration. There were tears and quiet applause, the sort made of relief more than triumph. After the testimonies, Mary asked the gathered people to walk outside to the sapling. They stood in a circle, hands linked, a fragile human ring around a slender tree. Mary spoke softly. "This tree is a reminder. We do not plant it because we are certain of a harvest. We plant it because we believe God gives growth and because we will tend what He entrusts to us." Then, in a gathered prayer, she said, "Father, keep our hands faithful. Let this be a place not of answer-seeking only, but of question-bearing together. Teach us to hold one another's burdens and to name what we cannot bear alone." That night, the sapling's ribbons fluttered in the breeze, and the village's chords vibrated with a new steadiness. The Gathering of Hope had become, for the people of St. Augustine, a practice, regular, imperfect, faithful. The movement's power lay not in spectacle but in the small days of habit, and in the readiness to move outward when another's need appeared. From that arc of events, the 7 miraculous truths, framed with the entanglement metaphor, extracted themselves naturally. Mary and the leaders began to teach them at meetings, not as doctrine, but as guideposts for living. Each revelation carried a story and a practical application, so that anyone listening could take one small step the next morning. Truth 1. Interconnectedness. What Mary's prayer began proved true. When one person's ache is named, it often finds response in others. The application was simple. Name needs aloud and invite the community in. Carry the humility of asking. If you're watching this, consider speaking one need into the circle you trust. No grand claims, no guarantees, just a small vulnerability that allows others to enter. Truth 2. Non-local compassion. Love and prayer reach beyond apparent distance. James's sudden call to his mother, prompted by a dream, revealed how compassion traverses unseen borders. Application: do the small, concrete thing that connects you to someone at a distance. Call, send a letter, light a candle. Let your reach cross visible limits. Truth 3. Synchrony and timing. Clara's falling into proper timing taught them to expect Providence's cadence. Not everything happens on our timetable. Application: cultivate patience and prepare practically. Lay down a plan of small, steady acts while you wait. Checks, appointments, calls, so that when Providence aligns with effort, you are ready. Truth 4. Amplification by coherence. When prayer and practical work point in the same direction, effects multiply. The Gathering's job board and the prayer circle were not separate. Together they carried transformation. Application: coordinate with others. Align prayers with action. Find one practical skill you can offer and one prayerful conversation to pair with it. Truth 5. Creation as witness. The world bears witness to God's movement in subtle ways. The fog that lifted, the tree that bore fruit, These were signs, not proofs. Application. Practice noticing. Take a week to journal small, ordinary signs of grace, a lifted fog, a kind word, a sudden warmth. Let nature remind you of God's presence. Truth. 6. The observer effect of faith. Faith changes perception and response. James's life changed not merely because opportunities arose, but because he began to see and accept them. Application. Rehearse expectancy. Keep a short list of small, achievable steps and expect grace to meet you in them, then act. Truth 7. Action follows revelation. Revelation without obedience remains a whisper. The gathering moved outward because they obeyed small calls. Application. Choose one tangible thing you will do this week to answer a revealed need. Bring a meal, offer a ride, volunteer an hour. Obedience is the language that turns insight into community. Each truth, when named, was followed by a short, practical prompt for those who listened, a way to translate narrative into habit. Mary believed that revelation must lead to action, not to mere admiration. The people of St. Augustine practiced this by setting modest goals. One ride offered, one phone call made, one seed planted. After several more months, the signs of change were not uniformly dramatic, but they were steady. James's work at the bakery earned him enough to pay for a small room. Clara continued her storytelling and began a circle for mothers. Thomas found himself mentoring more than he had imagined possible. Miriam's garden fed a dozen families, and her seedlings were now a community nursery. The sapling at the chapel was no longer slender and raw. Small branches reached as if to hold the sky. There remained questions about causality and the right balance between faith and prudence. Some neighbors still preferred explanation in terms of luck or chance, while others openly thanked God for what they had seen. The village held both attitudes with a humility that felt wise. They neither insisted they had proved God, nor pretended the only explanation was natural. They settled into a liminal stance, open to God's work, committed to practical care, skeptical of easy answers. Mary kept her candle on the kitchen table. She continued to pray, quietly, insistently, for her son and for the people she loved. She also kept a small ledger of practical steps, names called, rides offered, appointments set. She had learned that faith without the ledger could become wishful thinking. The ledger without faith could become merely efficient bureaucracy. The two, prayer and work, paired like strings in a harp, making a single music when tuned together. Before the gathering of Hope's one-year mark, the chapel hosted an anniversary supper. They invited everyone who had participated in any way, those who had prayed, those who had cooked, those who had received help. The room smelled of stew and wood smoke. People spoke not in grand theological treatises, but in sentences of gratitude. You sat with me. You brought my child warm bread. You believed in me before I believed in myself. The child messenger, now older by a year and known to everyone, moved through the room with a tray of small lanterns and set one on each table. The sapling outside had been transplanted to a sturdier spot and was wrapped now in a ring of stones children had painted. There was, in the gathered faces, a quiet knowledge. Life is fragile. Progress is messy. Hope often advances in small increments. The gathering had not resolved every wound. Some relationships remained strained. Some illnesses persisted. But more people were present than before. More hands were willing to hold burdens. Someone in the crowd, the man who had once been turned away, now steady in his work, stood and said, "This place taught me how to be human again." The room held its breath. No one proclaimed a panacea, only a shared path. Mary looked across the room at James. He stood near the food table, filling plates with care. His hands, once so uncertain, were now competent. He caught his mother's eye and gave a small, crooked smile, an honest admission that life was still hard and also a note of gratitude. Mary's heart swelled with a sorrow that was threaded with hope. She had not secured him a perfect ending. She had, however, learned to place him in a network of love that would carry him through many small failures and successes. Before the meal concluded, Mary invited everyone to stand and join in a short prayer. It was not a long sermon, but a listening prayer, a communal breath. They bowed their heads, and she spoke, addressing God in the intimacy of shared dependence. Lord, we thank you for the small things that feel like mercy. Teach us to live in the tensions, between work and waiting, between sobriety and risk. Keep our hands open and our eyes awake. Let the threads you have given us to hold be strong enough to bear one another. In Jesus' name, amen. That prayer, simple, direct, communal, was followed by the final practical exhortation Mary offered to the gathering and would later offer to listeners beyond St. Augustine. Keep tending what you have been given. Love is not a flash, but a discipline. In the months that followed, the Gathering of Hope inspired other small circles in neighboring towns. Not as replicas with the same structure, but as experiments in what happens when people gather their prayers and their work in the same direction. Some of these experiments faltered. Some bore fruit in ways the villagers had not expected. The movement's humility was not that it claimed universal success, but that it invited imitation with no guarantee, only with an offer. Come and practice. There are lessons, distilled now from that season, that anyone can try to live by. If you take nothing else from this story, consider these practical steps. Name one need aloud in a safe circle. Invite help without shame. Make one practical plan paired with a prayer. Schedule a call, bring a meal, offer a ride. Notice creation's reminders. Keep a small journal of ordinary signs. Expect possibility. Rehearse a posture of gentle expectancy, and then act on visible steps. Choose one small way to go outward this week. Pick up garbage, help a neighbor, teach a skill. Keep going. The most important act is the next small faithful one. Finally, let us pause and pray together. We lift our voices now, not to demand outcomes, but to submit our plans to the one who sees and sustains. Lord, we bring before you our small, fragile hopes. Teach us faithfulness in the little things. Give us courage to ask, wisdom to act, and humility to accept help. Bind us to one another so that no one among us bears alone. Let our hands be steady and our hearts gentle. In Jesus' name, amen. If this story has touched something in you, a place you want lifted, a need you want to name, consider sharing a brief testimony in the comments or with someone you trust. Tell one person about a time when small, steady kindness met you and changed you. The Gathering of Hope began with a single candle, and a mother who refused to hold her worry alone. Perhaps your single word can become another thread in the same net. May you be encouraged to gather, to keep showing up, and to practice the 7 truths. Interconnectedness, non-local compassion, synchrony, amplification by coherence, creation as witness, the observer effect of faith, and action that follows revelation. Let the image of entanglement be only that, an image, to help your heart see how God sometimes knits us together. Not a scientific claim, but a spiritual invitation. To live entwined in mercy. If you have been moved by this message, share a short testimony below and pass this story along to one person who needs a reminder that they are not alone. Join the circle of those who will practice small acts of love together. In the simple repetition of those acts, lives are slowly rearranged,